The traditional media traffic has absolutely plummeted, has fallen off a cliff. The traditional media companies, they are dying. People don't care anymore. Well, don't take my word for it. Here is the data. The traffic to the actual websites, the New York Times, is down 34% year over year. The Washington Post is almost down half. It's down 44%. But it's not just print, whether it's digital or physical newspapers. It's also the television as well. Network television seeing a massive decrease. CNN down 38%, Fox down 34%, MSNBC down 25%. These numbers are astonishing to most people. There are multiple reasons why this is occurring. One of the best reasons is because people are losing trust in the institutions. They obviously don't believe that the New York Times or the Washington Post, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC are telling them the truth. If you think that you're being lied to, if you think that there's manipulation of the facts or the information, if you think that people are simply regurgitating information in a perspective to get you to believe something, to enhance the division in our country, you simply can turn off the television or you can stop clicking on the articles. And obviously, that is one piece of what is happening here. On top of that, for the last 18 months or so, there has been absolute hysteria, both economically and from a public health perspective. Obviously, there was tons and tons of people who kept turning to the news, whether it was network television or the papers, and saying, what the hell is going on in the world when it comes to the virus or the economic impact of it? If you remember, CNN literally had a death scoreboard on their television show every day, 24/7. You turn it on and they told you, look what the score is. Look at how many people have died so far. And they not only did it here in the United States, they did it globally as well. It was depressing. Every time I would see it, I would want to shut it off because who the hell wants to see that every single day? On top of that, also, we are coming off the presidency of Donald Trump. And if you go back to 2016, Donald Trump had said, the news media will die if I'm not around. And I'm paraphrasing, but ultimately that is part of this as well, is that they knew every time that they put his name in a headline, those articles, or they talked about him on a television segment, those segments became more popular. Whether that's good or bad, he understood that and the media understood that. There was a game going on. And so the media kept talking about him. He kept doing stuff to get them to talk about him. So ultimately the traffic had surged. So whether you believe that there's a loss of trust in the institutions, whether you believe that the COVID and economic stuff ends up now people aren't as interested, or you believe it has to do with a president that is not nearly as kind of headline driven, the traffic is down. And ultimately, what I think this tells us is two things. One, this is an opening for other types of media outlets, whether they are people like Joe Rogan or other types of actual media companies to come forward and take some of this market share. But also, two, is that they are becoming more desperate. And when media companies become desperate, they then start to concoct all kinds of crazy ideas. They can create all sorts of division in the society in order to get people to pay attention. They can create narratives that take hold to get people to click or to watch. And also, they start to tell you crazy, crazy things like, if you don't do what we tell you, you will die, which quite literally is what was being told to us all year last year. And so I think that this data is not only important to understand, but to unpack why it's happening. And when you start to understand why it's happening, you start to see that the long-term trend is that the mainstream media is losing power. They're losing a voice. And ultimately, people are starting to realize, rather than listen to the talking heads on mainstream media, maybe what I should be doing is going and finding the market participants. Maybe I should be finding the source information. Maybe I should stop listening to what they have to say because obviously they are biased. But at a minimum, if I'm going to listen to what, let's say, Fox News says, maybe I should actually pay attention to what CNN and MSNBC says. If you're going to get biased news from all corners so that you can have a more well-rounded perspective and try to figure it out for yourself. My only message to people is defund the media. The way to defund the media is stop clicking, stop watching, and literally start learning for yourself. Now, it's hard to do that. And so ultimately, you can either go find independent sources of information, or you can simply consume it and then say, I'm going to focus in 2022 on thinking for myself. What do you guys think in terms of seeing? I mean, these aren't like, hey, the traffic's down 5%. We're talking about 25 to 44% across these different mediums. That's big numbers.
Massive numbers. But so I think about it in the context of a few different things. One, I think a lot of this was due to Trump, right? If you look up the numbers relative to where they had been historical, they were up a lot during his presidency. He was constantly providing clippable moments, quotable moments, etc., where people were giving headlines. There was a bunch of clickbait. There was all these things people were generally interested in. He was a very polarizing president for sure, regardless of which side of the aisle you sat on. So I think that was part of it, right? If you set the base so high, then ultimately anything below that, you're going to be down drastically. So that's certainly part of it. Two, I think that certainly over the last year, there has been a rise in independent journalism and people that are creating content on their own. I know just like I don't know the statistics for sure, but if you looked at my inbox, just the amount of blogs or Substacks or independent journalists that are delivering content daily, weekly, etc., the amount that hits my inbox has drastically gone up, like tenfold probably from a year or two ago. So that has obviously been a trend that has accelerated throughout this digital internet age where information is abundant. And then three, I think like part of it is, it's just the pandemic. Like a lot of this stuff has gotten crazy over the past 12 to 24 months. And I think a lot of people have opened their eyes and seen what is really driving a lot of these businesses. And it is the idea of creating outrage. It is the idea of clickbait. It is getting your attention in whatever way they possibly can. And a lot of that is done through fear, right? So when you think about it in that context, I think people over the last year or two are getting fed up with it. And they're realizing that a lot of the stuff that they're being showed either had a twist to it or is just outright not true. And ultimately, it only takes a few of those times to start changing your sources. If you say, hey, look, I read this article. It was extremely deceiving based on the title and kind of what they were explaining versus what the reality of the situation was. If that happens once, okay, whatever. I read this source all the time, not a big deal. 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, you start to get fed up and you start looking for alternative sources. And I think there has been a huge distinction and importance placed on first level sources, right? The original source. And I think that a lot of people are opening their eyes to the context that provides. And that's why we've seen this continued shift. And ultimately, this is only a trend that's going to continue, right? There's more people that are leaving their jobs every single day and going to do this independent route. And that's good for a few different things. Obviously, it hurts them from a leverage perspective, right? You don't have the whole staff, you don't have the resources that these places typically provide, but ultimately they're able to speak more of the truth or their truth, right? What they see, their worldview, and ultimately the consumer is who ends up deciding if that is true or not, right? You get to go decide, hey, I agree with this source, I don't agree with this source, I don't like the way they interpreted this, I like the way they interpreted this, and ultimately that's what's going to change things is more people opting out of that system, right? So when you say defund, just stop reading, right? If you don't agree with a source or a news corporation or an outlet, stop reading their information. Go to other sources. There's plenty of them out there now. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 12 to 24 months.
John, before we get your perspective, we have one more chart here that shows that online, most that turn to news websites, except for the youngest people, they're all older folks. Right. So if you look at this right here, on a percentage basis, news websites or apps, 32, I think this is, percent of U.S. adults who get news often from news websites and apps, it's 65 and older. If you then look at people over the age of 50, right? Again, huge percentages. And then obviously, if you look 30 to 49, it's still, very much heavily weighted with news websites or apps. What I find fascinating is between the ages of 18 to 29, they actually don't get their information from news websites or apps. 42% of it comes from social media. And so I say fascinating because there's an argument for that being a good thing. That's an argument for that being a bad thing. But the fact that is such a big percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds, I think is interesting. The second thing I think is interesting is 18 to 29-year-olds, they get just as much from news and websites or apps as they do from search. So there's an equal weighting at 28%, right? Versus if you look at 30, 50, and 65 age cohorts, basically it's still weighted much more heavily to the news websites versus these other things. And then lastly is podcast. So the younger people listen to podcasts, right? 12% versus, let's say, over 65, they'll listen to 3%. Now, the podcast could include news podcasts, but they also could include things like independent information sources, et cetera. But when you start to see that someone between the ages of 18 to 29 is essentially 4 times more likely to listen to a podcast to get their information versus somebody over the age of 65, I don't think that's surprising. But when you actually see the numbers and you start to recognize this, it's, look, the area where information is coming from, the consumption is changing. And ultimately, social media is just a new distribution platform, right? The same information, like, well, guess where all the news websites go and distribute their information? They're trying to go to email, they're trying to go to podcasts, they're trying to go to social media, etc. And so I don't know if necessarily the information's different on social media. It's just a different medium, and understanding where these cohorts are consuming their information is important if you want to continue to remain relevant and kind of remain in front of the younger cohorts as they age into, you know, your core demographic.
Well,
right?
part of that too makes me think that it levels the playing field a little bit, right? Because traditionally, if you were an outlet and you built up this massive distribution, right, you had the capital to go distribute newspapers, right, on a very small level, and then you built up this capital to go do these massive productions on TV, and you were paying for these slots and everything. You had that distribution that you were paying for, that your capital allocated enabled you to do that. And social media has totally flipped that on its head, right? Anyone can start a Twitter account, anyone can start an Instagram account, anyone can start a YouTube channel. And sure, there is some advantages that come with news outlets having that built out distribution, but ultimately, we've seen countless people do it. You can start from zero and build a big account just based on your beliefs, your research, your work ethic, and all of that. So ultimately, I think social media has played an important role in the competition of ideas, right? In the free market of ideas, and allowing people to debate these things. And obviously, the truth doesn't always win out. We've seen various scenarios where people use fear and other tactics to engage with people and build followings. But ultimately, it's been a good thing from an independent journalism side, because it enables more people to be involved, and it further pushes forward the competition of ideas in a free market.
John, what do you think about this?
Everyone's biased. Every media company that you listen to, every person on the internet, they're all biased in some way, shape, or form. I think that if you watch Fox News, for example, you should absolutely turn on CNN. I think it's important to get both sides of the argument and both sides of thinking, and then you can kind of form your own opinion, because everybody just spins the story to fit their narrative and what they want to say, right? You see countless times where media companies will go out and they'll actually fund a survey just so it fits their narrative, right? So the independent creators, I think, is awesome for both social media, Substack, like all the companies that are capitalizing on this, but people are being able to publish their ideas in a new way that it traditionally hasn't been. And then when you look at podcasts, I don't really think a lot of people are getting news from podcasts. I think it's possible within the next 10, 15 years, but it has to be timely, right? That's why I like Twitter so much, is because it's very, very timely, and you can kind of crowdsource a bunch of different ideas. You can like easily find new people. But yeah, it's not surprising at all that younger people are using social media rather than watching CNBC or watching like different news outlets. And if anyone wants a good book on media manipulation and all that, Trust Me, I'm Lying by Ryan Holiday is a great book for that.
That is a good book.